and then turned it over. Okay.
Mute off.
Sorry, we have oh, maybe this mic couldn't hear me. Becca, can you say something if you can hear me?
Yeah, can you hear me okay?
Yes, perfect.
Okay, great.
Okay.
I just need to figure out how to share my slides.
All right, so
they're PDF.
I pass control to you.
Oh, I think I figured it out.
Okay, fantastic. We're not seeing anything yet, but
just give me a minute.
Okay. See, there's WebEx tech support out here. Let me go check my computer, make sure I gave it to you.
They're loading.
Okay.
So while they're loading, I just wanted to say it's can everyone hear me? What, Wendy?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay, can you see me?
Yep, we can all hear you. Okay, can you hear us?
Okay. Yeah, I can hear you. Okay, I just wanted to say it's a really thank you, Joe, for the wonderful introduction. It's a really great honor to be able to present. Can you see my slides now?
Yes.
Fantastic. Let me see how to toggle through them. Great, fantastic. Okay, so I just wanted to say very briefly, it's a great honor to be able to present to you. I was more excited to present in person because I always like to give talks in person. So I'm going to give a very high overview on entity resolution. I'll explain what that is. And specifically, I'm going to talk about measuring and reporting quality. I've been very, very lucky in my career to have had conversations with people like Bill Winkler, Steve Feinberg, my advisor, Jerry Ryder, and they've heavily influenced my opinions and how I think about this topic. And so you'll see this as I go through my talk. So I'm going to talk about this problem called entity resolution. And also, I'm going to talk a little bit about why it's so difficult. So entity resolution is a problem, also known as record linkage or deduplication, depending on where you fall into a space, such as computer science or statistics, machine learning, et cetera. And what it does is it's pointing these large, noisy data sets to remove duplicate entities that are often in the absence of a unique identifier. And so what are some motivations of this? Well, the biggest motivation, I have two very large motivations that have influenced me in the past 4 to 5 years. And the first one begins with Syria, the current conflict in Syria. And this is regarding work that I've had an ongoing collaboration with the Human Rights Data Analysis Group, and they're a group out of San Francisco, fantastic, led by Megan Price and Patrick Ball, and they work on many different human rights applications. And what happens here is you have human rights groups that are collecting data, and they're collecting it on the ground. Specifically, journalists are collecting this information on the ground, and what they have is duplicated information regarding individuals who died in conflict. And typically, the question of interest is, well, how many individuals have died during the conflict, and what's the standard error associated with that conflict? And if you think about that as a fundamental question, that's very difficult to answer, especially with the duplication, the noise in the data. It's a very difficult question. And so this question also arose from conversations I was having when I was at Carnegie Mellon about the census. And this was happening right after 2010. And so these were lots of conversations I had, for example, with Bill Winkler. So, you have duplicated information that arises when individuals fill out a census form every 10 years. So maybe multiple people have different homes and they fill out too many census forms, and so they're double counted or they're counted too many times. Or, for example, what often happens with college students is they're counted by the college that they're attending or the school they're attending. However, their parents also count them in their census form when they fill it out. And so how do you account for these duplication discrepancies in order to accurately reflect a population size for census year? And so the real goal is estimation of the sample or the population size and associated standard errors. More than this. So what I really want to get into in the end of my talk is robustness, sensitivity, evaluation metrics. What should we really be thinking about? What are our standards of practice? What should we be reporting to not only our colleagues, but those higher up, and then also what should we be reporting to the public so they understand and transparent. And so I'll get to this again. So I'd like to just start out with, well, what does the record linkage problem look like from a westernized perspective? So you'll have these generic data sets that you maybe have something like Apple, Amazon, Google. You have these nodes, which I'm representing by entities, so they have names on them. But an entity is more than just a name. And what we're really trying to figure out is, well, is the purple C. Feinberg the same as this red C. Feinberg? And if they are the same person, then what I want to do is I want to put an edge on. And then maybe over here, you can, if you look very closely, you can see the I and the E are flipped. So maybe I'm not so sure that they're the same C. Feinberg. Maybe it's a typographical error, or maybe they're actually different C. Feinbergs. And so I'm not sure. So I need more feature information, more textual information. So then I can think more about this information about this entity, this person. And so I have, for example, just an example of what a node here would look like. So I have a node regarding Larry Wasserman. So using publicly available information on the web pages, Larry Wasserman, he has an address, he has a phone number, he has 2 cats, his favorite color is purple. There's information about Larry. But there's other Larry Wassermans. So how do I discern that one Larry Wasserman is different from a different Larry Wasserman? How do I do this? The other question is, how do I do this in an automated, quick way, not in a manual way? And then how do I think about evaluation metrics to understand that I'm getting, the right Larry Wasserman, the real one, or that I'm getting the real Steve Feinberg? So just as another example, so again, taken from the white pages, here's an example of a Steve Feinberg. So you have an address, you have an age range here, you have a phone number, and then you have a different Steve Feinberg. You have 2 Steve Feinbergs in Pittsburgh. You have a different Steve Feinberg with a top-coded age. But if you just look at them, these clearly aren't the Steve Feinberg. They have very different addresses, they have very different ages, and they clearly have very different phone numbers. But again, how do we do this in an automated process? And what's the background here on record linkage? And how should we approach this problem? And how would we approach it for something like the Syrian civil war or for a census enumeration? So here's it's the same type of example as the westernized example, just showing it for Syria. So here I just have 3 different Syrian data sets. The nodes now are simply in Syrian Arabic. And you can think of the Steve Feinberg example as being the same as it was before, except now everything is written in Syrian Arabic. And then if I go behind this purple node, I would see feature information about this person, who has died in some particular way in an area in Syria, and I would have future information on that. So the core kind of question I get asked the most is why is entity resolution or record linkage so intrinsically difficult? And I think this is the key piece of the problem to really understand. So suppose that we have M total records and we can have D total data sets. So as modelers or just as social scientists in general, we're often seeking models that are much less than quadratic. Or if I'm thinking about just from a probabilistic or mathematical perspective, I want this computational cost to be much less than big O of M squared. And this is really hard. If you look in the literature, there are very few models that satisfy constraint number 1. And then at the same time, in number 2, we're seeking models that are reliable, they're accurate, they fit the data well, and they account for the uncertainty of the model. And when I say the uncertainty, I mean the uncertainty of this record process. And so if you think about these two goals, they fundamentally go against one another, and they make record linkage a very challenging problem. Because typically you can only have constraint 1 or constraint 2, and it's very difficult to have both of them at the same time. So in the rest of the talk, what I'm going to do is I'm going to review the literature, and then I'm going to present a Bayesian method or some Bayesian methods general Bayesian methods that satisfy 2. I'll point you to a framework that actually does satisfy both 1 and 2. However, there are only 3 papers that I know of that do this. So I want to point out how difficult it is to actually satisfy 1 and 2 at the same time. So I just want to start with some terminology. So I want to start with what is deduplication, what is record linkage, what is blocking. And then I'll get into some of the literature, a quick example. I'll talk about what I think we should be doing in terms of quality evaluation metrics. And then I'll be very happy to answer questions and get into the discussion. So I just presented what in the graph, the very large graph I presented, I'm thinking about, if I go back to my large graph, here I have many different databases, and I can have duplication within a data set and across a data set. And that's really nice because I can think of record linkage as this very general problem. And I can also account for the record linkage uncertainty exactly. So what is deduplication? Well, deduplication is where I'm cramming every single data set together and all the nodes and features into one data set. And so I'm putting all of these records into one data set, and then I'm doing my record linkage method or process all at one time. And so what am I losing here? Well, I'm losing a lot of information because I can't actually propagate the record linkage uncertainty exactly. And that can be problematic. And so it depends a lot of times on the question that you're asking. So these are two very different problems. So a lot of times people will look at this deduplication problem when they care a lot about speed or accuracy. So much of the literature can be grouped into the space of deduplication. Common examples, both in academia and industry, they consist of logistic regression, random forest, support vector machines, Bayesian adaptive regression trees, or BART, locality-sensitive hashing. And the main benefit you get here is a drastic computational speedup, and the loss you're getting is the uncertainty cost. So again, I'm calling this process generally record linkage, since we're looking at the record linkage uncertainty of the entire graphical structure. Okay, so what is blocking? So if I come back to the first constraint that we had, we desire models or processes that are much less than quadratic. And if we think about this, if I suppose I have two data sets, and I do all-to-all comparisons, and I have n total records, then I'm going to be doing m squared comparisons, and as m is really large, that's going to be intractable. So oftentimes, one will perform this notion of blocking or partitioning due to the fact that the record linkage in practice requires a quadratic number of comparisons. So if you look at the red space on the left, this is just saying that, well, I'm having to, if I think about a record comparison being one pixel on the screen, that comparison of just one pixel, that's a very costly comparison. And if I keep adding all of those up, I get this entire red space. And that's bad. That's going to be quadratic. But if I can come up with some very clever partitioning, and I can partition this into the space of these blocks that are non-overlapping, then my computational savings would be screen space, and this would be much less than quadratic. Now, of course, in practice, these blocking mechanisms are very difficult to come up with. And so that's a whole problem that's worked on in the literature just on its own. So let's talk about blocking just for a moment. There's two very common methods that are used for blocking. One is deterministic, and the second is probabilistic. So what is a deterministic blocking method? So a deterministic blocking method would be where, suppose I have a data set that is on medical data, and it has full date of birth, it has gender, and it has the state where a patient lives in. Well, maybe I think gender is fairly accurate. And so I may decide that I'm going to assume that gender is going to, I'm going to decide that I'm just going to partition everything on gender and treat it as a deterministic feature. Well, then I'm going to block on this feature and not consider it into my model at all. And so then I get a computational saving. I could also do that on other features, such as maybe I think date of birth year is also very accurate for this particular data set, and I could also do that. And so this is commonly done in the literature. But what is the negative side? Well, once you fix the deterministic feature that you're blocking on, you can't propagate an error. But the upside is that it's very fast, because you're able to ignore those features because you're treating them as accurate. So for just some pointers of some methods for deterministic blocking, Peter Christian has a fantastic book where he covers blocking extensively. I have a paper with Sam Ventura, Mauricio Sabinle, and Steve Feinberg where we go into these deterministic blocking and other blocking methods that was in privacy and statistical databases, and we do very robust comparisons of just going beyond deterministic blocking. And then we can turn to probabilistic blocking. So what is probabilistic blocking? Well, this is saying that I don't want to have a deterministic blocking methodology. So I'm going to choose my blocks using some sort of probability mechanism. But I have to choose that, and then I also want to look at the computational cost. So there's different types of these. You could use k-means. You can use k-nearest neighbors. You can use some sort of indexing technique. One of the more successful ones is known as locality-sensitive hashing, and the idea of this is that it puts similar items into blocks, and this stems from the computer science literature. And I've referenced a paper recently where a PhD student from Rice and a collaborator of mine have applied this work to the Syrian data set, and it's worked quite well, and it scales linearly. what are some common methods for entity resolution now, or record linkage? So once you have this computational speed up for entity resolution, what could you do? Well, the first thing that typically people might start with or look at are the original framework for entity resolution, which derives from Newcomb, who was looking at doing this for genetics in 1959, and then Foley and Sunter were also thinking about this very, very carefully around the same time. So what they were doing is they were simply just performing a simple likelihood ratio test. So the idea is you perform a likelihood ratio test, and if that likelihood ratio is larger than some threshold, then you say that the two records are a match, and otherwise it's a non-match. And so it's very, very, very simple. It's been extended, a great deal in the literature. Of course, there's some deficiencies, like any method. Let me turn back just quickly to a couple other of things that are used in the literature that I brushed over. The first thing you can do, of course, is if you have a unique identifier and you know that it's very accurate, you could simply just match on that unique identifier. This typically isn't the case with very noisy data, such as census data or serine data, so this often doesn't work. You could also perform, so in the social sciences, a lot of people like to perform what's called exact matching. So what is exact matching? So exact matching is where you take record 1, and you take another record, say record 2, and you compare these two records on all their features. And if all the features match exactly, say on some distance metric, such as Jarrow-Winkler, then you call it a match, otherwise it's a non-match. Of course, this is going to, if you look at any type of evaluation metric, this is going to perform very, very, very badly. And so this is why people, such as Newcomb and Foley Sunter, were starting to think about more systematic ways, such as likelihood ratio tests and hypothesis tests. So here's an exact example of where exact matching does very poorly. So we know that just by looking at these from our eye, that these two T Feinbergs, wouldn't be the same. And by exact matching, the error rates here would also be very, very, very high when comparing this to an exact match. So exact matching is typically going to perform very, very, very badly. So coming back to the Foley and Sunter method, so what they were doing is they were specifically applying this to two different databases. They were making all-to-all comparisons of records. So this is a quadratic computational method. The threshold, again, that I mentioned is some threshold T. You have to figure out what this threshold would be, and it's not obvious what that threshold would be and how you should choose it. There's also an issue that may not be obvious. So if you think about a likelihood ratio test, transitivity, this idea of transitivity is not preserved. What is transitivity? Well, suppose I have record 1 and it connects to record 2, and record 2 connects to record 3. Then I'd like to make that closure, and that's transitivity. And so transitivity isn't naturally preserved under a likelihood ratio test. And so there's major limitations and flaws of this method because there's many different ways that you could try and preserve transitivity under a likelihood ratio test. So just one other comment under the Foley-Sunter method is there was some very interesting work that was done by Sedinley and Feinberg in 2013, looking at this problem more in depth of resolving the transitivity issues, and actually also extending it to not just 2 databases, but to an arbitrary number of databases. And so this appeared in JASA. But also what they found is this was intractable for more than 3 different databases. So it's not scalable. And so the reason is because the reason has to do with transitivity. So because as you add more databases, you're having to look at different configurations of transitivity. And so this makes it computationally not scalable. And so this is one of the reasons I really don't like the fully assumptor method when you're adding an arbitrary number of databases and then also trying to preserve transitivity. Okay, so now let's turn to evaluation metrics. So how should one evaluate performance of a particular record linkage method? So these are my personal opinions, but this is from looking at a lot of different data sets over, I would say, about 5 years. So typically what we're looking for recall is the precision. You can also think about this as 1 minus the false negative rate, 1 minus the false positive rate. We'll also look at something called the reduction ratio, and I'll define these more formally. We'll look at the estimated sample size, the standard error of the estimated sample size. We'll look at the computational runtime. We can also derive the computational complexity. One should look at the robustness to the tuning parameters. This is very important. And something else, if you're using a supervised method, is it overfitting the data? So I'd like to just go through a little bit of terminology. So some of this is probably familiar to you, but I'd like to go through it anyway. So if we have pairs of data that can be linked in both the hand-matched training data, which we refer to as truth, and under the estimated linked data, then we'll refer to the situation as being a true positive. I'll call this a 2P. If we have pairs of data that can be linked under the truth but not linked under the estimate, these are called false negatives. If we have pairs of data that cannot be linked under the truth but linked under the estimate, then we call these false positives. And then if we have pairs of data that cannot be linked under the truth and also not linked under the estimate, we refer to these as true negatives. So this leads to the following definition. So the recall is defined to be the false negatives over the true positives of false negatives. And so you can write this out as 1 minus the false negative rate. You can also look at the precision. So the precision is the number of false positives over the true negatives of false positives. So this is 1 minus the false positive rate. And so if you're a statistician, you'd be looking at something like the false negatives and the false positives. If you're in the computer science community, you'd be looking at the recall and the precision, but it's just one minus the other. So you're wanting your recall and precision to be close to 1. You're wanting your false negative rate and false positive rate to be close to 0. So then we come to the reduction ratio. So the reduction ratio is measuring the relative reduction to the comparison space from some sort of blocking method. So it could be a deduplication, it could be a deduplication, indexing, or hashing technique. So it's saying that suppose the total number of comparisons that I have when I start is a billion. Well, what's the reduction that I move down to from using this indexing technique? And so, of course, you'd also want to look at the recall and precision when you're looking at these blocking methods. And you want to redo this when you look at the record linkage technique. So just for some, if you're wanting to refer back to formal definitions of this, you could see the Peter Christian's book on this. He has multiple papers as well. We also define this in our PhD paper in 2014, where we talk about blocking extensively. So what are other evaluation metrics? So in many cases, for example, in Syria or the census, And often in survey statistics, you're wanting to look at an estimated sample size. You know, you're wanting to then look at some sort of uncertainty quantification about this. You should also be concerned with, well, what's the runtime? What's the computational complexity? What's the robustness to the tuning parameters? Do supervised methods overfit the data? You know, for 1 and 2, you may be looking at something a little bit different. So it could be a function of the sample size. And so then it would just be a function of that parameter. So the estimated sample size and standard error must be defined for each method, but this is typically not difficult to do in practice. And any method can be evaluated for the runtime, so you can gauge the computational costs and you can compare them effectively. And to me, robustness of the tuning parameters is very important from either a Bayesian or a frequentist perspective. And as I said before, it's really important to make sure that the supervised methods are not overfitting the data, because oftentimes they are. So I'm going to talk about this a little bit, and specifically this is coming from a paper of mine from 2015. So I'm not going to go into the details of the method. I'm just going to show some of the results. So the example I'm going to look at is a publicly available data set. It's from the record linkage package in R. Specifically, everything I'm going to show you is also from a package in mine called Blink. It's on CRAN, it's in R. There's vignettes on it, so it's completely reproducible. And what I did is I compared many different methods according to evaluation metrics that I just laid out. So I'm first going to describe the data set, and then I'm going to compare it to my method, which I call Blink. And I call it Blink because it's doing Bayesian linkage. I'm going to compare it to logistic regression, random forest, and then BART. So here's the data set. So it's a very small data set. It's 500 data points. It has unique IDs that you can compare against. The method I'm using is it's a Bayesian generative model. It's completely unsupervised. This particular data set, it consists of 500 records with 10% duplicates. I'm just showing you the first 6 lines of it. So it has the names are in German. So you have first and last names. You have some missingness here. You have full missingness. So what we do is we just remove the missingness here. And then you have full date of birth. So you only have 5 features. So the output of the generative model that I proposed in 2015 is you end up getting this posterior density for the estimated sample size, which is n. And you also get the false negative rate and the false positive rate. So here, what you end up getting is 0.04 and 0.02. And so these are so you want these to be very close to 0. So these are quite low. And then also what we're getting on the right is so you can view this model as a graphical model where transitivity is automatically guaranteed via a little bit of theory. And so what I'm showing here on the right is the fact that this model only makes one false positive set, and that's shown in the red. All of the black ones they're correctly identified compared to the ground truth. And this was simply just done using the iGraph package. And so this is just a simple illustration and a visualization of how the model works, and especially how it does visually. And so if you look at the little data points, the little singletons, those are singleton clusters, and the little widget-looking points are simply these double clusters. So then what I looked at is I looked at Blink. This is the method I proposed. And then I looked at it compared to exact matching. Then I looked at it, okay, I said, well, so in the social sciences, such as psychology, other fields, people will do something called near twin matching. So they'll say it's a match if it agrees on at least two fields. Then I looked at it for BART, random forest, and logistic regression, giving it different percentages of the training data. So the whole idea is you break it up on a test and training set. You feed that in, you give it a classifier, and then depending on the output, you either classify it as a match or non-match. And this is kind of the state of the art of what's done in industry. So typically in industrial companies such as like Google, Facebook will use something like random forest or support vector. And so I looked, for example, at the false negative rate, false discovery rate, just to get a sense of how the error rates were doing. I looked at other things of, the estimated sample size, the standard deviation, and the sensitivity to between parameters. And so this is here where you want to make sure that such methods, such as supervised methods, aren't overfitting. And of course, it's important to note here that already an unfair comparison because Blink is completely unsupervised, whereas the other methods, such as BART, random forest, logistic regression, are supervised. You're giving them, at the very minimum here, 10% training data. Okay, so the next thing I just want to briefly touch, so I want to touch on two more things. I want to talk about how do we make sure a method is robust. So for a semi-supervised method, we want to make sure it's robust to different choices of the training and test data. That's something that I just talked about. And we also want to make sure that it's robust to any training parameters. So of course, you can do this by, 5 tenfold cross-validation. And then for a probabilistic and Bayesian methods, we want to make sure these methods are robust to choices of hyperparameters or tuning parameters. You, of course, want to make sure they're robust to many different types of data sets. And so in practice, what we try and do is apply these to 5 to 10 different types of data sets to make sure that the method is actually fully robust to, very simple data sets to the most complicated data sets. So robustness, computational time complexity, and sensitivity analysis. You can look at further details if this interests you. For example, we talk about this at great length in my 2015 paper, and then with a collaborative paper with Rob Hall and Steve Feinberg that appeared recently in JASA in 2015. So when Joe asked me to give this talk, he asked me, what do I think record linkage really means? And I think this is really important. I think it's becoming one of the most important topics, potentially over the next, 30 to 40 years, especially given the rise of big data, the amount of data that's becoming readily available, at our fingertips. And I think one of the things that's really lacking are workshops and forums where people can talk about ideas and what we need. And so I think this workshop is really great because of that. The second thing I thought about is there's not enough open source software. So if you look at the amount of open source software for record linkage, it's very thin. And this is a problem because if you move down the list that I'm going to talk about, it makes it really difficult to then move into reproducibility and fairness. So I also strongly believe that, paper should be fully reproducible. If you hand me something, I should be able to reproduce it. I should be able to reproduce it very quickly. This is something I require of all of my students, my postdocs. And I believe in really fair comparisons. And it's really hard if there's not open source software and sharing with the community. In terms of evaluation metrics and comparisons, in terms of this, I would turn to the precision, the recall. I think these are things that are really vital for understanding how good a method is. In addition to the reduction ratio, I think there's some other evaluation metrics that don't necessarily mean that your method is performing well, and there's papers starting to come out regarding that. I think comparisons are also really important. I think it's important to do lots of comparisons so you can understand how well a particular method is working and how robust it is. I think also transparency is incredibly important. But I think it's important for academic, statistical agencies to be very transparent with their collaborators, colleagues, and also the general public about what they're producing, what they're doing. Even when something isn't going well, of how they're improving, things of that nature. And then turning to 6 and 7. So these are tougher, and I think these will take a long time to push on. But to me, ethical use of data is really important. How with the emergence of more and more data, how should we be handling this? For example, with IRB protocols, merging, for example. How should we be handling sensitive data? And this is maybe more from an academic perspective, but how should we think about sensitive data, data privacy in general, the fact that data privacy in the United States is currently very ill-defined. Maybe it will be better defined with the upcoming Supreme Court case against, with Microsoft in the fall. Data privacy is a fundamental right in the EU, but it's not a fundamental right here. So I think these are things that we should be talking about. And then proper privacy protections of sensitive data. I think it's fantastic what the Census Bureau has been doing regarding, adding differential privacy, like John and Jerry and others have been doing. And I think a lot of that work has been phenomenal. So I think there's a lot of things that, especially in terms of the public, when they hear about it, they would like to know about it. And so some sort of white paper or something like that would be very, very beneficial because they don't know about it. So, I mean, that goes, anyway, those are just some of my thoughts. Some sort of key papers that I would point to regarding some of these ideas for fair comparisons. Peter Christian, he amazes me. He's a computer scientist out of Australia. He's a fantastic speaker. He's been very influential regarding my thought process from a computer scientist perspective. I wouldn't have enough slides to list the references for him, but he does really fair comparisons, and he'd be a great person to bring in as a speaker. For other fair comparisons, Mauricio Cedinle has done some really, really, really nice work, and he tends to do very fair comparisons. And I'd like to think that in some of my work with Rob and Steve, we also did fair comparisons as well. Turning to record linkage and privacy, there hasn't been a whole lot of work, in my opinion, that's pushed forward privacy-preserving record linkage in a sound way. But there's a paper that I really like by a postdoc, Danusha Vetzlatin, and Peter Christian and Christina O'Keefe and Veracos from 2014 that appeared in JPC. And every student that comes into my lab, I have them read this paper, and I just think very highly of it. So this is something to point to. There's been very little done on record linkage in terms of, a paper on reproducibility and fairness. But, I've talked with David Dumpton a great deal about this because we agree very much on this principal concept, and Victoria Stodden is very well known for this area. So is Cynthia Rudin, even though they don't work in the space. But they might be people to reach out and come in and get the talk The last kind of thing is I have a recent paper that's in minor revision with Betty Chen and Anshu Shirastava that touches on some reproducibility, fairness, and evaluation regarding the Syrian conflict and other data sets. It's on arXiv and on my webpage. And then finally, getting to the ethical use of data, specifically with respect to human rights. There's been a lot of work done by David Banks, Megan Price, and Patrick Ball at the Human Rights Data Analysis Group. And to me, they've done the most fundamental work in this area. And so I think one idea is kind of having a larger workshop and kind of bringing a lot of these people together that have thought very carefully on such really important issues. So I'd like to thank you, and I'd also like to thank the National Science Foundation, both for my career award and for my Big Data Privacy Award. The views of this talk are mine alone, and not of the funding organization or of the Census Bureau. And I'd like to thank Joe again for the invitation, and again, it's a great honor to be able to speak to you. If you look at my webpage, all of the papers that I've mentioned of mine are there. If you have questions about the other papers, I'm happy to point them to you, and all of our open source software can also be found on my webpage.
Thank you, Rebecca, and we'll turn it over to Bill. Get this thing up here. That's what I thought.
Slide deck? Did you send it? Oh, here they are. Okay.